Everyone in my family saw my sister as the golden child, and me, just the disappointment they tolerated. From the moment she could walk, she had this glow about her that made people want to praise her. It didn't matter if she was doing something basic like tying her shoes or reciting the alphabet, people treated it like it was a miracle. Meanwhile, the narrator had always felt like a background character in their own life story, like someone observing from the shadows while Lena took center stage. The difference started early. In school, Lena brought home straight A's and honor roll certificates, and their parents would frame them like museum art. Every fridge magnet was clinging to a picture of her winning something. Spelling bees, science fairs, even a poetry contest she barely cared about. When the narrator got a B+, there was polite nodding but no celebration. If they stumbled or struggled in school, it wasn't seen as effort, it was failure. Even when they tried to excel at something else, something artistic or different, it was dismissed as a nice hobby, not something that mattered. Family dinners were always the same. Lena would dominate the conversation, talking about her day, her plans, her endless string of achievements, and everyone listened like she was some oracle. The narrator would try to join in, maybe share something funny that happened at school, or mention a project they were proud of. But the room always had this way of getting quiet, in a way that wasn't encouraging. Sometimes someone would cut them off entirely, turning the spotlight back to Lena like the world made more sense when it was on her. It wasn't just the parents either, uncles, aunts, cousins. They all acted like Lena was a royal descendant. Every holiday she'd be showered with gifts, praise, and questions about her future. The narrator, on the other hand, was asked if they were still into drawing or if they had figured out what they were good at yet. It wasn't said with cruelty, but with that kind of pity that cuts deeper than insults. The worst part wasn't the comparison. It was the invisibility. They weren't even worth comparing half the time. At school, things weren't much better. Some of the teachers even mentioned Lena when calling the narrator's name during attendance, asking if they were related. When they said yes, the reaction was almost always the same. Raised eyebrows, a wow, she was something else. And then a silence loaded with expectation. It was exhausting being held up against someone who never stumbled, never failed, never did anything but shine. Even socially, Lena had this magnetism. She was popular, charismatic, the kind of person who walked into a room and changed the temperature. The narrator wasn't shy, but somehow they always felt small in her presence. Friends would gravitate toward Lena at family events. Classmates would mention her in admiration. And even the boy the narrator had a crush on once told them, without realizing the sting, that he wished he could meet someone as cool as Lena. Their parents never tried to hide the favoritism. They never said it outright, but it bled into everything. Lena got a car for her 17th birthday. Not a used one either, a brand new sedan with a giant bow on top like some sitcom. The narrator got a second-hand bike with rust on the handlebars and a half-hearted, "You'll get your turn one day." But that day never came. Their wins were always explained away, their struggles magnified, and their values seemed to be measured only by how much they weren't like Lena. What hurt the most was that Lena wasn't cruel. She wasn't the stereotypical mean older sister. She wasn't manipulative or hostile. In fact, she was often sweet in the most patronizing way possible, like giving compliments that sounded more like favors or checking in on the narrator's life as if it were a side quest in her story. She'd say things like, "You're actually pretty smart, you know. You just don't apply yourself." Or, "You could be really cool if you tried harder." Always with that tone, the one that didn't mean to hurt but did anyway. Despite everything, the narrator tried to love her. They tried to be proud of her, to support her. They clapped when she graduated early, when she got into her dream university, when she landed a high-pay internship at some fancy law firm downtown. But every clap felt like a brick, building a wall that kept them farther and farther apart. Their only refuge was their grandfather. He was the only person in the family who didn't treat them like an afterthought. He listened. He remembered things that mattered to them. Favorite books, dreams of traveling, little drawings they'd done in childhood. He kept some of those drawings in his wallet, worn around the edges from years of being folded and refolded. When they talked, he made them feel like their words were worth something. He didn't compare, didn't correct, he just saw them. But even with him in their corner, the shadow Lena cast was hard to escape. As the years passed, the gap widened. Lena moved out, started building her perfect adult life, while the narrator stayed close to home, juggling part-time jobs and classes, trying to carve out a path without the spotlight. It wasn't bitterness, it was just survival. They had learned long ago that trying to compete with Lena was like racing a cheetah with a broken leg. Still, there was something in them that hadn't given up. A flicker of belief, small, stubborn, and buried deep, that they mattered too. That their story wasn't just background noise in Lena's highlight reel. That maybe, one day, someone would see them the way their grandfather did. Not as the forgotten sibling, not as the disappointment, but as someone worth listening to.
And that day would come, though not in the way anyone expected. The day the narrator got the call, the world seemed to stand still. It was early in the morning, far too early for any kind of good news. And the phone rang with that hollow, sharp tone that always carried bad omens. On the other end of the line was their father, voice tight, clipped, and uncharacteristically quiet. Their grandfather had passed away in his sleep. Just like that, he was gone. There was no long illness, no hospital vigil, no time to prepare. He'd been there one day, warm, wise, and gently laughing, and then he wasn't. The narrator remembered how, just a week before, they had sat with him on the back porch of his small house, sipping tea and watching the sunset paint the sky. He had told a story from his youth, something about a road trip that ended in a flat tire and a first kiss, and they had laughed together. Now that moment lived only in memory. The funeral came quickly. It was simple as he would have wanted. Small chapel, family and a few close friends. Lena delivered the eulogy, of course she did. Everyone said she was so composed, so graceful, even in grief. She wore her sadness like it was tailored to fit her. She said all the right things, how much their grandfather loved his family, how proud he had been of them all, how he had left a legacy of kindness. People wept, people clapped, people nodded with misty eyes. The narrator stood in the back, silent, holding the edges of their jacket like a shield. No one asked if they wanted to speak. No one even looked their way. After the service, the family gathered at their grandfather's home. It felt cold without him there. The furniture looked smaller, the air thicker. Photographs of his life lined the walls, including some of the narrator, pictures no one else seemed to notice. A drawing they had made in second grade still hung near the kitchen light switch, faded and curling at the corners. Somehow that hit harder than the casket. Everyone knew the will would be read soon. Lena joked quietly that it was probably going to be straightforward. The house, the savings, the car. Surely it would all go to her. Their parents didn't contradict her. In fact, they nodded along. Even their uncle, who had barely visited the grandfather in years, assumed Lena would handle things. She was the responsible one, the smart one, the perfect one. The narrator stayed quiet. Part of them believed it too. Why wouldn't it go to Lena? That's how things always went. She won, they lost. She received, they endured. It was the rhythm of their life. But something didn't sit right. Their grandfather wasn't like the rest of them. He wasn't blinded by Lena's shine or deaf to their own voice. He saw them, truly saw them, and he had told them once, on that same porch swing, that he had made sure they'd be okay one day, even if no one else believed in them. At the time, they thought it was just something kind to say. Now, it echoed in their mind like a whisper from beyond. Days later, the official will was read in a lawyer's office downtown. The narrator wasn't invited. They only found out it had happened from a passing comment their mother made while folding laundry, like it was no big deal. Apparently, the house and the savings, nearly everything, had gone to Lena. The narrator got a single sentence, "To my other grandchild, I leave my love and my memories." As if the words cut like ice. It didn't make sense. Their grandfather had loved them. He'd said so countless times. He had promised. He would never just leave them out like that. Not unless something had gone horribly wrong. Something didn't add up. The feeling wouldn't go away. It gnawed at them late at night while they stared at the ceiling, turning the words over and over in their mind. So a few days later, they went to the old house. It was technically Lena's now, but the keys hadn't been collected yet, and no one was around. They knew the back window near the laundry room never locked properly. The house welcomed them like it remembered. They wandered the quiet rooms like a ghost, retracing old footsteps. Everything was where he had left it, his slippers by the door, his glasses on the nightstand. In his bedroom closet on the top shelf, behind an old cigar box, they found a small leather binder. Inside was a will, not the one the lawyer had read. This one was handwritten, dated just 4 months earlier. It was clear, direct, and detailed. It left everything to the narrator: the house, the savings account, even a note mentioning the drawing by the kitchen light switch. It was unmistakably real. And at the bottom was his signature, shaky but authentic. Shock hit first, then confusion, then rage. Someone had tampered with the will, replaced it, hidden it, and all signs pointed to Lena. She had been the first to visit the house after he passed. She had stayed behind after the funeral to collect things. She had made comments about how simple the will would be, and now the narrator held in their hands the truth that had been buried. It wasn't just about money, it wasn't about property or bank accounts. It was about being seen, being chosen, being valued for once in their life. Their grandfather had believed in them, enough to entrust his life's work and memories to them, and someone had taken that away. They left the house with the binder tucked under their coat and a fire burning in their chest. The truth was out there now, and they weren't going to let it stay hidden, not this time. No more silence, no more shadows, no more letting Lena win by default. It was time to be seen. The narrator didn't sleep that night. They sat on the floor of their small apartment, the binder open in front of them, staring at every page, rereading every sentence like it might vanish if they looked away. Their grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable, neat in some places, shaky in others, but undeniably his. Every line had intention, every clause had weight. The house, the savings account, his old car, and even a collection of first edition books he loved. Everything was meant for them, not Lena, not split among the family, just them. There was a letter, too, folded and tucked into the back of the binder in an envelope with their name on it. The handwriting on the front hit harder than the words inside. It had been a long time since someone had written their name like that, not as an obligation, not as a formality, but as something that mattered. Inside, the letter was simple. Their grandfather explained why he had made the changes, how he had seen their struggle, how proud he was of the resilience they had shown. He wrote that Lena would be fine with or without help, but he wanted to give the narrator something he knew no one else would. He ended it with a line the narrator would never forget. "You are more than what this family lets you believe. Take this and build the life you deserve." And yet somehow all of it had been buried, hidden. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened. The narrator thought back to the funeral. Lena had stayed late at the house after everyone left, claiming she needed time to say goodbye. It had sounded poetic then. Now it felt staged. That night, the original will must have been found and destroyed, or so she thought. She must have called the family lawyer afterward, producing an earlier, outdated version of the will, or maybe even a forged copy. The rest of the family didn't question it. Why would they? Lena was the golden child. Her word was gospel. The betrayal burned in the narrator's gut like acid. This wasn't some childhood squabble or innocent oversight. This was deliberate, strategic, cold. And yet, the narrator didn't storm into the family home screaming accusations. They didn't call Lena and demand answers. No, something inside them had shifted. They were done being impulsive, done being ignored. This time they would be smart. They would be careful. They would make it count. So they did what Lena had probably never expected. They started gathering proof. The first step was the lawyer. They called the firm that handled the estate and asked politely about the will on file. The assistant was hesitant, but after a few back and forths and mention of being a named party in the will, they confirmed that a typed version had been submitted just a few days after their grandfather's death. No mention of the more recent handwritten one. The narrator asked if they could see a copy. There was a pause, then a promise to send one by email. When it arrived, the narrator studied every detail. The signature was close, but not quite right. The date was 6 months older than the one in the binder, and most importantly, the contents were vastly different. Lena was the sole heir. No mention of the narrator, not even a generic family reference. They knew now with certainty what had happened. Over the next week, the narrator dug deeper. They took the handwritten will to a document expert, someone who could analyze the ink, the paper, the signature. It cost them nearly a month's worth of rent, but it was worth every penny. The results came back confirming authenticity, the signature was genuine, the paper aged appropriately, no signs of tampering. At the same time, they started documenting everything. The letter, the will, the conversation with the lawyer's office, photos, scanned files, voice memos, a digital folder with backups stored in the cloud on a USB stick, and even emailed to a trusted friend just in case. Lena had played dirty, but they weren't going to let her win this time. The hardest part wasn't the evidence or the logistics. It was facing what this all meant. Because beneath the anger, beneath the betrayal, there was a deeper hurt, one that had nothing to do with property or legal battles. It was the realization that their sister, the person they had once looked up to even when she cast shadows over their life, had knowingly taken something so important and tried to erase them from it, not just from the will, but from the legacy of the only person who had truly loved them without condition. There had always been a gap between them, but this was a chasm. And yet the narrator didn't cry, not this time. They felt something steadier, sharper, a quiet determination that wrapped itself around their heart like armor. They knew what needed to happen next. They waited until the family was together again, an upcoming dinner at their parents' house to celebrate Lena's promotion. Of course, even in the middle of mourning, Lena's triumphs couldn't wait. But for once, the narrator didn't feel like a background guest. They had something Lena didn't. The truth. They walked into the house that night with the binder in their bag and their spine straight. Lena greeted them with that same polished smile she always wore. Perfect teeth, perfect tone, perfect lie. The rest of the family barely glanced up, already asking Lena about her new office, her team, her bonuses. The narrator waited. They listened. They let her have the spotlight one last time. Then, when the conversation lulled, they reached into their bag and placed the binder gently on the dining table. They didn't yell, didn't accuse, just looked around the room and said calmly that they had something everyone needed to see. Lena froze. Their parents looked confused. An uncle laughed nervously. But when the narrator opened the binder and began reading from the will, the mood shifted instantly. Words hung heavy in the air. Words of love, of intention, of clarity. The narrator handed out printed copies of the document analysis, the expert's certification, even the letter from their grandfather. It was irrefutable. The silence that followed was deafening. Lena stammered. "Denied," said it must be a mistake. She looked to their parents, to anyone, but the tide had turned. Some still tried to defend her, suggesting there had been confusion or a mix-up, but too much of the truth was staring them in the face. For the first time in their life, the narrator wasn't invisible. They were undeniable. And Lena, she was exposed. After the confrontation, silence took over the dinner table like fog rolling into a valley. No one knew what to say. The air felt tight, electric, like something sacred had just been shattered, and no one had the courage to sweep up the pieces. Lena didn't make eye contact. The narrator sat still, hands folded, the binder closed again in front of them. For once, there was nothing more to prove. The evidence had spoken. What they had carried in their bag was heavier than legal papers. It was truth. Not the kind that could be argued away, not the kind that twisted in the wind. This was the kind that planted roots and changed everything around it. Their parents were the first to speak cautiously, as if stepping through a minefield. They suggested the will might have been an oversight. Maybe their grandfather had forgotten to file it properly. Maybe he was confused. He was older, after all. But their words didn't carry conviction. They didn't look at Lena while saying them, and they didn't look at the narrator either. Deep down, they all knew the truth. It wasn't about confusion or clerical error. It was about deception. And someone had orchestrated it. Lena finally spoke. She claimed she hadn't known about any newer will, that she had submitted what was in the house. She said she assumed it was the right one, but her voice cracked in places it never used to. She fumbled where she used to glide. For the first time, her confidence looked borrowed instead of earned. The narrator didn't interrupt her. He just watched, because what was happening now wasn't about forcing a confession. It was about exposure. A curtain had been pulled back, and Lena's polished image didn't fit the reality anymore. Whether she admitted it or not didn't matter. Everyone in that room had seen enough to doubt her. And for someone like Lena, doubt was poison. After dinner, the narrator left without saying much. They didn't need validation or applause. They already had what mattered. Their grandfather's faith, his words, his will. That was enough. But something deeper shifted in the days that followed. The narrator had expected to feel victorious, vindicated, maybe even smug. But instead, what settled over them was something softer and more unsettling. Grief. Not just grief for their grandfather, but grief for the illusion that had finally crumbled. They had spent years believing that maybe they were the problem, that if they just tried harder, stayed quieter, achieved more, maybe then the family would see them the way they saw Lena. Maybe then they'd be worthy of a seat at the table. But now they understood the truth. The favoritism hadn't been about merit. It had been about comfort. Lena made the family feel successful by proximity. She was the shiny reflection they wanted to see in the mirror. The narrator, on the other hand, had always made them uncomfortable. Too different, too quiet, too real. That realization hit harder than any insult ever had. So, instead of celebrating the win, the narrator returned to their apartment and began unpacking something they hadn't touched in years. Their own identity. Who were they, really? Without the shadow of comparison, without the weight of trying to be enough. The house was now legally theirs, thanks to the valid will and a follow-up with the family's lawyer. There had been some legal noise, but once the evidence was submitted, including the handwriting analysis and notarized validation, everything fell into place. The lawyer had apologized, slightly embarrassed that such an important update had gone unnoticed. Still, the narrator didn't move into the house right away. Instead, they visited it in quiet intervals. Sat in the living room with a notebook, stood in the kitchen just to listen to the way silence moved through the walls. They found items that told stories, handwritten recipes, old postcards from road trips, a photo album tucked behind a radiator filled with moments no one else had seen. It felt like their grandfather was still there, not as a ghost, but as a presence. As if the house itself remembered him. One afternoon, while clearing out his study, the narrator found an old cassette recorder tucked into a drawer. Inside was a tape labeled, only with a date, 6 weeks before he passed. They hesitated, heart pounding, then pressed play. His voice came through, soft but clear. He spoke like he was talking to someone he loved, like he knew they'd find it someday. He talked about the past, about regrets, about how hard it had been watching the family slowly drift into roles none of them could escape. He said he saw the narrator trying, but they were the one who never asked for recognition but deserved it the most. He said he changed the will not because he wanted to take something from anyone, but because he wanted to finally give something that mattered, a chance, a clean slate, a foundation. The narrator cried for the first time since the funeral, not out of pain, but out of release. That tape became something sacred, not because of the assets or the validation, but because it reminded them that love, when real, leaves evidence. Not always in grand gestures, but in small, deliberate ones. A will, a letter, a voice on a forgotten cassette. They eventually moved into the house, not to claim victory, but to begin healing. And as they unpacked boxes, repainted walls, and brought life back into a space that had been paused in time, they understood something they hadn't before. This wasn't about beating Lena. It was about becoming themselves, fully, finally, freely. The house became more than inheritance. It became a symbol of reclaimed worth, of love that defied the family hierarchy, of a truth that couldn't be erased, no matter how hard someone tried to bury it. And from that foundation, the narrator began to rebuild not just a home, but a sense of belonging that no one could ever take away again. The house didn't change overnight, but over time, it began to feel less like someone else's memory and more like the narrator's future. They started small. Fresh paint in the hallway, new curtains in the living room, donated a few old furnishings that no longer held warmth. They kept certain things untouched, though. Their grandfather's favorite reading chair, the photo of him smiling beside a lake, the vintage wall clock that still chimed 5 minutes late. It was healing in the quietest sense of the word. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just on. Some mornings they'd wake up, brew coffee, and sit on the back porch watching the world slowly stretch into day. No calls, no expectations, no constant pressure to explain or justify their place in the family. For the first time, they weren't surviving, they were simply living. Lena didn't come around anymore. Neither did most of the family. After the truth came out, things shifted. The narrator wasn't outright disowned, but the warmth had been stripped from their interactions. Conversations became short, transactional, often passive-aggressive in tone. Texts went unanswered. Holiday invitations stopped arriving. And honestly, that was fine. They realized they weren't missing connection, they were shedding obligation. The version of family they had once yearned for was a mirage, one where they were included, accepted, even celebrated. But the reality was never going to match that fantasy, and letting go of that dream, painful as it was, made room for something new, something real. Friendships deepened. People who had always hovered in the periphery, coworkers, neighbors, an old friend from college, began showing up in meaningful ways. One neighbor, a retired art teacher named Mrs. Keller, started coming by with baked goods and stories about her late husband. They'd talk on the porch for hours. There was no judgment in her gaze, no hidden competition, just presence. The narrator even began volunteering at a local youth center, helping teens with resumes, college applications, or just someone to talk to. It gave them purpose, a reason to step outside the walls of inheritance and offer value to others. But more than that, it felt like legacy. Their grandfather's belief in them had planted something powerful. And now, every small act of kindness, every hour spent mentoring or listening, felt like honoring that belief. Still, the house held shadows, moments they had to face alone. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, they found a small cedar box they'd missed before. Inside were letters, old ones, from years ago, letters they had written as a kid, birthday cards, Father's Day notes, random drawings with "I love you, Grandpa" scrawled across the page. He'd saved them all, every single one. They sat on the floor with those letters spread around them like fallen leaves, tears rolling down their cheeks, not because of sorrow, but because of recognition. They had mattered. They had always mattered, even when the world made them feel invisible. The final shift came on a Sunday morning when they received a message from Lena, short, almost clinical. She said she'd be contesting the will, claimed emotional manipulation, even hinted at legal action. A part of the narrator had expected this, but another part, the newer, stronger part, was done with fear. They didn't respond. Instead, they sent everything to their lawyer, added one final document to their case file, and let silence do what anger couldn't. End the cycle. Because here's what they learned. Fighting for your worth doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like peace. Like no longer explaining yourself. Like walking away without the need to turn back and prove a point. A few weeks later, the contest was dismissed. The will stood. Lena's challenge fell flat against the wall of truth. After that, she disappeared from their life entirely. And that, too, was fine. Seasons changed. The house bloomed with new life. Books lined the shelves again. Friends gathered for dinners. Laughter filled the halls that had once echoed with grief. On quiet nights, they still played their grandfather's old cassette tape, letting his voice fill the rooms like a soft wind. A reminder, a compass. One day, standing in the doorway of the study, the room that had once held secrets, but now held sunlight, the narrator realized something had ended. Not just the legal battle, not just the family rift, but a chapter, a version of themselves, one built on striving, chasing, trying to earn something that should have been freely given. That version was gone. In its place stood someone new. Someone whole. They walked out into the garden, the morning air crisp, the sky wide and kind. There was no dramatic music, no applause, no cinematic fade out, just peace. And in that peace, the truest ending revealed itself not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. Because this wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a story about reclamation of identity, of legacy, of self. And as they sat in their grandfather's old chair with sunlight on their face and a life entirely their own, the narrator smiled, not for what was lost, but for everything finally found. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Sometimes sharing the story is the final step in healing.